So that's about it. Anyway, the original form of Newton's second law. So there's only one form. There's the Newton's form, right? And everything else is a lie. So this is where they try to say Newton said something he didn't say. But I mean, clearly, there's no such thing as the original form. I mean, that's just nonsense. You don't say that. It's Newton's second law. You either respect what it actually says, or because you're giant douches, you decide to put words in Newton's mouth that he didn't say. But those are the two choices.
I agree with that. And I went and read the part, the second law, from his book, The Principia, and turns out that your definition also does not match what Newton says. I will show that.
Newton's second law states that the net force, so it's net force, which would mean net acceleration, if you were to be fair, right? But anyway, acting upon an object is equal to the rate at which the momentum changes with time. So this is the big lie, right? Because Newton's statement isn't that. Newton's statement is the force, okay, right, equals, you don't need to worry about the rate if you're saying the net force. So when he says,
Right here, you make a distinction between force and net force, but there is none. When they say net force, they mean all the force. No, they don't mean force defined by acceleration, something like this. They don't mean that. They just mean, they think that. They just define it always as F equals ma. But they don't have that distinction between force and net force. They just mean all the force, the net force. They are paying lip service to what Newton said, which is the sum of the actions of the accelerative force upon the several articles of the body is the motive force of the whole. So basically, I can show you actually the text in the bottom, right here. See that? For the sum of the actions of the accelerative force upon the several articles of the body, the net force, all of the force in all of the matter, like you say, every piece of matter is a bucket that collects force. So you make a distinction that they don't they take, they don't think force is mass times velocity. They think that force is ma, mass times acceleration. Okay.
As F, he's giving you the option. You can have the F, the force, in seconds, like how much force per second, or you could have net force. But he doesn't say the net force. All right.
When you say that you can have the force per second, that is ma, because the change in force per second is the same as the change of momentum per second. And the change of momentum per second can be described as the change of the velocity in the momentum per second, that's acceleration. So you are saying the same thing that they are saying when you acknowledge that you can have the choice to describe force per second, FMA. That's it.
Acting on an object is equal to the rate at which the momentum changes with time. So obviously that's not relevant to the net force. That is the force per second. That's the force per a unit of time. So this is a perversion right there. Newton was basically saying the total force can equal the total change in your momentum, or if you, as in the case of gravity, it's a rate of change. So we're saying the force, which would be 9 meters per second, 9.8 meters per second, it would be in per second units. He didn't say net force. He wasn't even implying net force. He was clearly stating this is the force in units of how much force you're affected by per second per a unit of time. If you don't want the unit of time, if you want the net force, you just look for the net change in the momentum. The final change in the momentum equals the force. Newton was clearly saying F equals force. Equals momentum.
Okay. Now let's show that Newton did not say that force equals momentum from his own text. So we go to Newton. This is the Principia, translated to English. So we go to second law. The second law. The alteration of motion, the change in motion, the change in momentum is proportional. It doesn't say it's equal, it says it's proportional to the motive force impressed. And then further describes the direction. That doesn't matter. So the change in motion is proportional to the motive force, right? But you describe this as being force is momentum. It doesn't say is momentum, it says is proportional to momentum. Now, what the hell is motive force? Newton describes motive force too, so we can get into his head about what he means by motive force. So we gotta go to definition number 2. This is the definition of momentum, okay? This is not the definition of force, this is the definition of momentum. So he has a distinction between momentum and force. The quantity of motion is a measure of the same arising from the velocity and quantity of matter conjunctly. Then gives an example right here. So this is it. Definition 2, momentum. Let's make a fit in the screen right there. So he gives an example. In a body double in quantity with equal velocity, the motion is double, momentum is double. So I made a little writing down here showing, I'm gonna try to highlight it. So right here, you can see 2 times the mass in a body double in quantity, 2 times the mass with equal velocity with 1 times v equals 2 times the motion, 2 times the quantity of motion. That's his description of momentum. And the way that they describe today momentum is with a P. So he's saying in that statement, in a body double in quantity with equal the velocity, the motion is double. 2 mv equals 2 quantity of motion. Then further elaborates on the same example. With twice the velocity, it is quadruple. So now at that same twice the mass, you twice now the velocity. I made an example here. Twice the mass twice the velocity equals 4 times the quantity of motion. So momentum fits this definition, and he calls it quantity of motion. He didn't call it motive force, he called it quantity of motion. Now let's look at his definition 8. He's talking about centripetal force, and over here he makes clear what he thinks about force and motion. So let's go down here. While describing momentum, motive quantity of centripetal force, Newton makes clear his differentiation between force and momentum. Let's go right here. So you can read it for yourself. Is the accelerative force will stand in the same relation to the motive as celerity does to motion. Celerity means speed, means velocity. So he's saying that the accelerative force will stand in the same relation to the motive celerity due to motion. For the quantity of motion, quantity of motion, momentum, arises from the celerity, velocity, drawn into the quantity of matter. Momentum arises from velocity drawn into the quantity of matter, mv. And the motive force, see, this is the word he uses in the second law. He says the motive force impressed. The motive force arises from the accelerative force drawn into the same quantity of matter, ma. This ma, and he's saying it explicitly. The motive force arises from the accelerative force drawn into the same quantity of matter. So I made some notes trying to emphasize this. He says it again a little bit later. He says, the accelerative gravity is less, the weight would be equally diminished and would always be the product of the body by the accelerative gravity. Because he's describing the force diminishing when you are far away from the earth, like a really high, the weight is decreased when you are really high up. So he's describing that, and he says the product of the body by the accelerative gravity. He's defining F equals ma. Now, the motive force, right? That's what he called it. In the second law, let's go back to the second law. He says the alteration of motion is ever proportional to the motive force. He doesn't say the quantity of motion, he says the motive force impressed. So the motive force is proportional to the change in momentum, right? Because you have an object that is going, God damn it. So let's go back down here. So you have an object of some mass is going some velocity. To change its motion, to change its momentum, what do you need to do? To either change the mass or change the velocity. The object, we always speak of objects that have the same mass, but changing velocity. So if you change the velocity, what is that called? That's called accelerating or deaccelerating. So it is proportional. Acceleration and velocity are proportional. So that's why. That's all he's saying. He's not saying mass equal. No mass. Force equals mv. He's saying that momentum is proportional to force. And the force is defined as mass times acceleration, as he defined already in definition 8. You gotta read definition 8 completely to get that. You gotta read definition 2. Those two definitions come before the law so that you may understand. That's what he defines. You define something, like in a computer program, you define the variables, and then you use them. So he's doing that. He made the definitions, then he states the law so that you may understand it. So you're wrong when you say that it's not Newton's mass, F equals ma, and that momentum is force. Newton makes a differentiation between the two. So that's all the points I wanted to get across. Hopefully it got across. All right. Bye-bye.